Mobilized Central Committee. There were resignations from the committee in protest, most conspicuous of them that of Hugh Kenner, the critic who had himself only...
This, of course, is the voice of William F. Buckley, Jr., who was a political pundit and television personality.
That, I suppose, is Professor Kenner's greatest book.
Right now, he's in conversation with a great literary critic named Hugh Kenner.
Supreme achievement. By birth a Canadian, Mr. Kenner attended the University of Toronto, took his graduate degree at Yale, and went then to the University of California, where he became chairman of the English department at Santa Barbara.
Buckley and Kenner are talking about the poet and critic, Ezra Pound. Before I went to college, I knew little else about Ezra Pound. The way that I'd come to find out about him was through a conversation between my mother and her mother. We'd found a signed copy of the selected works of Ogden Nash, and my mother to my grandmother says, "Wasn't he an anti-Semite?" No, it wasn't Ogden Nash. It was...
To what extent was Ezra Pound a Nazi and an anti-Semite?
You said a Nazi? The usual designation was fascist.
If you know nothing else about Ezra Pound, it was that he was a poet and that he was an anti-Semite and charged with treason against the United States of America. This is all common knowledge. It's the commonest knowledge. And what I hope to do today is to dive into the life of Ezra Pound and really figure out what it was that he was all about. Something that modernism taught me is that it's really hard to tell history, that there's no definitive retelling. So in recounting the life of Ezra Pound, I'm not really recounting the life, just a version of it. One of the beautiful modus operandi of imagism and modernism is its precision and appreciation for what exactly is being said. Extra literary material need not be required. So, I guess in telling a story about Ezra Pound, it doesn't hurt to start here. Pound's family used poetry in seemingly unconventional ways, not just to entertain or move one another, but bureaucratically. Pound's grandfather, he would even write letters to the local bank president in verse. And his grandmother would write to her brothers in verse. So from the get-go, Little Ray Pound, that was his nickname, sees the people closest to him using language in interesting ways. In his early teens, Pound is enrolled at Cheltenham Military Academy in Pennsylvania, and he absolutely hates it. Eventually, he decides he needs to find a way out of this place. So, being the perseverant and determined child that he was, he learns Latin. And in 1898, at the age of 15, he's accepted to the University of Pennsylvania. Smart kid. At Penn, Pound studies language and meets William Carlos Williams and Hilda Doolittle, who will later become known as H.D., two very influential poets of the Modernist movement. And here's one of the astounding things about Pound's life and his place in history. It's that during his formative years, he seems to not just meet, but make an impact on everyone. From T.S. Eliot to James Joyce to W.B. Yeats to D.H. Lawrence, we're talking about some of the biggest literary influences of the century, all of whom were influenced by him. Pound goes on to receive his BA at Hamilton College and then his MA at Penn in Romance languages. And it's during this time that he starts to think about writing a very particular kind of poem. And these thoughts are going to haunt him until the day that he dies, this particular poem. It's an epic. It's a history. And he spent all this time incubating in languages of all kinds, having learned Latin, Italian, Spanish, and having studied Chinese. He's driven to get everything he can from these languages, everything from their varieties of sonic textures to their visual appearances on the page. So, Pound eventually becomes an instructor at Wabash College in Indiana, but being implicated in a scandal involving an actress staying the night in his dorm, he's fired from his position and books it to Venice. He publishes his first book there, called A Lume Spento, from his own money, and eventually he moves to London, where he meets his wife, Dorothy Shakespeare, his lover, Violet Hunt, his best friend, Ford Madox Ford, and his tribe in the literary community. Ford, in 1909, grants Pound his first publication in a magazine, the English Review. The poem is a sestina. Now, a sestina, it has a very involved form. It revolves around 6 words, one of which appears at the end of every line. Wait, I'm going to back up, sorry. Poem, it's got 6 of those stanzas all have 6 lines in them, and then the last is really describe what the poem does. From one side to the end of each of those lines, read it. So, for example, if I pick the word peace from one all right, I'd better just shut up and let you listen to this.
Damn it all this stinks peace. You horse and dog all, come, let's the music. I have no life save when the swords clash. But when I see the standards gold of air purple opposing, and the broad fields beneath them turn crimson, then howl I my heart nigh mad with rejoicing. In summer have I great rejoicing, when the tempests kill the earth's foul peace, and the lightnings from black heaven flash crimson.
I think it's curious that the first poem that Pound publishes in a magazine is one with such rigorous rules. When I read this poem aloud, I can hear the faint metronomic push of the pentameter. And Pound doesn't strictly adhere to meter in this poem, but its influence is audible. During his stay in London, Pound meets Margaret Craven, an American musician hanging around the same crew of wealthy bohemians as him, and she offers her patronage, which allows him to really hone his craft as a critic. He doesn't have to worry about paying rent, so he spends all of his time writing. And think about this. Pound has all this incredible experience behind him and in front of him. I mean, he has 6 years of collegiate education in which he trained his attention on language. He's meeting all these incredible poets and thinkers, including Henry James. And he's got 6 centuries of English literature to read and reflect upon, including its most recent eras, which Pound detested the most, the Victorian and Edwardian ages. In his essay Prolegomena, Pound writes, "As to 20th century poetry, and the poetry which I expect to see written during the next decade or so, it will, I think, move against poppycock. It will be harder and saner. It will be what Mr. Hewlett calls nearer the bone. It will be as much like granite as it can be. Its force will lie in its truth, its interpretive power. Of course, poetic force does always rest there. I mean, it will not try to seem forcible by rhetorical din and luxurious riot. We will have fewer painted adjectives impeding the shock and stroke of it. At least for myself. I want it so. Austere, direct, free from emotional slither. Pound will shape this impulse into what will become imagism. He becomes obsessed with efficiency, in saying as much as possible in not just as few words as possible, but the most appropriate words as possible. So much to the point that he would start off with a draft of, say, 30 lines of poetry, and then whittle them down to just 2. No story sums this up as well as this one, I think, which I adapt from Pound's essay, How I Began, in the third person for the sake of dramatic intensity. For well over a year, Pound had been trying to make a poem of a very beautiful thing that befell him in the Paris underground. He got out of a train at La Concorde, and in the jostle saw a beautiful child's face, and then, turning suddenly, another, and another, and then a beautiful child's face, and then another beautiful face. All that day, he tried to find the words for what this made him feel. That night, as he went home along the Rue Renoir, he was still trying. He could get nothing but spots of color. He remembered thinking, if I had been a painter, I might have started a wholly new school of painting. He tried to write the poem weeks afterward in Italy, but found it useless. Then, only a few nights later, wondering how he should tell the adventure, it struck him that in Japan, where a work of art is not estimated by its acreage, and where 16 syllables are counted enough for a poem if you arrange and punctuate them properly, one might make a very little poem, which would be translated as follows. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And there, or in some other very old, very quiet civilization, someone else might understand the significance. Pound, however intentionally, and knowing him, it was probably quite intentional, him being a stickler for accuracy. He tells 2 versions of the same experience, of being in the underground, seeing these faces, and in doing so, vividly illustrates the demands of imagism when they are observed. First, we get an extensive retelling of the story, and then a complete distillation. In the second telling, Pound ditches all the poppycock for a harder, saner retelling that brings us closer to the bone. Imagism has 3 tenets. 1. Direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. 2. To use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. 3. As regarding rhythm, to compose in the sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of a metronome. This led to the rise of free verse poetry in the 20th century. And though we may think of free verse as being loosey-goosey, as having no rules whatsoever, T.S. Eliot famously said that no verse is free for the man who wants to do a good job. Meaning that poets still had to think hard about sonic and metrical principles, where to end the line, which words needed emphasis, which words needed muting, the very aspects that made the greatest metered poems, well, great. With these tenets in mind, Pound and the Imagists had a clear path to writing intensely compressed poems, many of which spanned only a few lines, like this one. O fan of white silk, clear as the frost on the grass blade, you also are laid aside. Or this one. Spring, too long, Gongula. Now these intensely compressed poems are beautiful and piercing. But remember, Pound had ambitions, grand ones, and he was not about to let the imagistic tenets hamper the capabilities of his poetic intent with a 3-line maximum. He wanted to write epic poems. So how on earth was Pound going to do that if every 30 lines he wrote yielded him 2 lines in the end? The logistical but less satiating language of narrative stories and poems, the language that describes the way that somebody gets from one place to another or how time passes, though they're less satiating, they do help make varying parts of a story adhere to one another. But according to Pound, there's no room for that in good poetry. Good poetry must only include words that contribute to the presentation, or what is being perceived most emphatically. The things that directly contribute to the shape and tone of the experience. Tone. Tone would actually become the answer to Pound's question. He would construct longer poems by juxtaposing varying tones against one another. In 1915, Pound writes Villanelle, The Psychological Hour, a poem of 40 lines. He increases line quota by like 1,000, and in it, Pound conducts the narrative movement by modulating the tone from section to section. Tonal modulations come by way of playing with diction, the words you choose. We talked about this in episode 2, and also by playing with syntax, sentence structure, of which there are infinite possibilities. Also, you can play with line length, image. Basically, you have to take advantage of all poetic craft elements to shift the way that the language makes us feel. Here's a metaphor. A musician can play a note one way, but just by changing the angle of the bow or of the drumstick or your embouchure, we might experience that note in a dramatically different way. Now, all while Pound and HD and the other imagists are playing, albeit seriously playing with language, outside the walls of poetry, shit is going down. World War I breaks out, and it wreaks havoc upon the earth, upon mankind, and even perhaps at the core of it all, the human mind. Mustard gas, machine guns, tanks. It looks like the end of the world, even more so than before, because death has never been so rapidly manufactured on the battlefield. What was once viewed as a dignified and honorable pursuit has become something else altogether. 17 million deaths, 20 million wounded. The war subverts the capacity of the human imagination, of grief. And importantly for people like Pound and T.S. Eliot, it subverts the capacity of language. And for a while, there are no words. People are hysterical. and they cannot seem to make meaning of this experience in language. But eventually, Pound, Eliot, other poets like Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, who we mentioned before, and fiction writers like Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner, they go looking for the right words and the right way to illustrate what they've seen from this new perspective. This perspective will become what's known as modernism. This and Pound's descent into fascism and madness next time on Wordshop 101. For all of the latest content, please go to wordshop101.com. If you have any writing that you'd like to get a second pair of eyes on, email it in a Word document to wordshop101@gmail.com. See you guys soon.